The photograph was not classified. That was the first thing Undersecretary Vale Oren noticed when the document packet arrived on her terminal. The image was simply there, attached without encryption, without restricted headers, without even a courtesy warning. Just a photograph of a human city at night, taken from low orbit, the lights sprawling across the dark continent like a fever dream of scattered embers. Underneath it, a single line of notation in Standard Galactic, written in the clipped bureaucratic shorthand of the Conclave's administrative arm. Asterisk population density within acceptable disarmament survey parameters. No defensive fortifications visible from orbital altitude. Asterisk. Valoran stared at that last sentence for a long time. She had processed 11 disarmament surveys in her career, 12 species, and every single one of them had defensive fortifications visible from orbital altitude, because every species with enough technological sophistication to build cities also built walls around them. It was not a law. It was simply what civilizations did. The humans had not. She flagged the image and moved on to the next file. She had a full survey to process before the conclave session began. There would be time to think about the photograph later. There was not. The conclave of assembled worlds had debated the human question for approximately 19 of Earth's months before the vote finally passed. Valoran had watched every session from her administrative seat, which was positioned precisely far enough from the chamber floor that she could observe without being consulted, a distinction she had learned to appreciate early in her career. Administrators who were consulted became administrators who were blamed. Administrators who observed became administrators who survived. The resolution was called the Galactic Stabilization Accord, though nobody called it that in private. In private, every species with a delegation in that chamber called it what it was: the demand that humanity surrender its weapons. Not all of them. The conclave was careful about its language, as it always was. The resolution specified strategic armaments, the large-scale, civilization-ending categories. Nuclear warheads above a certain yield. Orbital bombardment platforms. Atmospheric processing weapons. The category of instruments that, in the conclave's measured diplomatic phrasing, represented an asymmetric threat to galactic equilibrium. Asymmetric threat, Valoran had written in her notes that day. She stared at the phrase for a moment before underlining it twice. The conclave had accepted 41 species into full membership in its 4,000-year history. It had issued the Stabilization Accord exactly once before, to the Dretheri, a hive-intelligent species from the Velan cluster who had developed self-replicating orbital weapons platforms 700 years ago. The Dretheri had complied within 60 cycles. They had also never recovered politically, and their delegation now sat in the chamber's furthest tier, a courtesy presence rather than a functioning voice. Humanity had been given 90 days to respond. They responded in 41. The answer was yes. Ambassador Sarah Mackin watched the conclave chamber fill from behind a screen of diplomatic glass that separated the human delegation's observation suite from the main floor. She was 44 years old, had spent 16 of those years in deep space postings, and had developed the particular stillness of a person who had learned that the moment you let a room see you react, you had already lost something you could not name. Behind her, her attaché, a young man named Dominic Farrell who was 26 and still believed that visible enthusiasm conveyed competence, was reviewing the projected text of the compliance agreement on a handheld display. "They're cutting the list," he said. "I know. They added 4 new categories since the draft we received last week. Subsonic delivery systems for atmospheric deployment are now included. That's a significant." "I know, Dominic." He lowered the display. "You don't seem worried." Sarah did not answer immediately. She was watching the alien delegations arrange themselves on the chamber floor below, the small choreography of status positioning that preceded every major session. The Keth Avalon delegation, whose species had pushed hardest for the accord, had taken the center-adjacent positions. The Murath observers, enormous, gray-chitined, rarely speaking, had settled near the exits, as they always did. Something about enclosed spaces and ancient instinct, the cultural briefing said. "Ambassador," Dominic tried again. "Tell me something," she said. "How many of those species down there have ever been invaded?" He paused. I'd have to check the... None of them, she said. Not one. In 4,000 years of Conclave membership, not a single member species has experienced a surface invasion by a non-member hostile power. She paused. Ask yourself why. Dominic opened his mouth. Closed it. The answer seemed obvious, so he said it. Because the Conclave's collective deterrence has never been tested, she finished. We're signing the agreement tomorrow. Make sure the compliance documentation is ready. She turned away from the glass before the session formally opened, which meant she missed the moment when the Keth Avalon primary delegate looked up at the human observation suite, studied it for 3 full seconds, and then said something quietly to his aide that no recording system in the room was positioned to capture. The aide wrote it down anyway. That note would not surface for another 7 months. The compliance process took 11 weeks. Human teams worked with conclave verification inspectors across 14 sites on 4 continents and 2 orbital installations, and the inspectors filed reports with the kind of administrative precision that institutional bureaucracies generate when they are trying to demonstrate thoroughness without actually understanding what they are looking at. Valoran read every report. She was not assigned to the human compliance case. She was assigned to the Farathi membership application, which was proceeding normally and required approximately 40% of her working attention. The other 60%, which she did not document, went toward the human files. The first anomaly appeared in week 3. One of the verification inspectors, a Keth Avalon named Solentar who had processed 6 previous compliance surveys, flagged a notation in his site report. Human facility personnel requested explanation for decommission protocols before complying. Protocols were explained. Compliance was immediate and complete. Anomaly. Personnel appeared to already understand protocols before explanation was provided. Reason for initial inquiry unclear. Valoran read that paragraph 4 times. She pulled the inspector's audio logs. Solentar had a reliable recording habit, a professional tic that had occasionally created procedural complications when his candid observations made it into the administrative record. She found the relevant segment from the facility walkthrough at an installation in what humans called Nevada, a geographic designation that meant nothing to her but which she noted for later reference. The human technician's voice was calm, almost conversational. We just want to make sure we're reading the same spec. The Accord lists this category as including delivery-capable ground-launched systems above 40 kiloton yield. We're decommissioning everything above 30. Is the inspector's understanding consistent with ours, or is there a discrepancy we should document? The pause. Then Solentar's voice. The threshold specified is 40 kilotons. Right? The human said. So we're going 10 below threshold. Is there a procedural preference for how we notate that in the compliance record? We want to be precise. The recording ended there because Solentar had apparently stopped his device to answer a separate communication. Valoran sat with the audio for a long moment. The human had known the threshold exactly, had decommissioned past the threshold voluntarily, and had asked about notation precision in a way that suggested the documentation itself was important to them. She pulled the compliance records for the other 13 sites. Every single one showed the same pattern. Humans complying to, and slightly beyond, the exact specified threshold, with careful, meticulous documentation of the margin. She created a new file folder on her terminal and labeled it with a string of administrative code that would not attract attention. Then she wrote one sentence inside it. They are not surrendering. They are recording. 7 months after the accord was signed, the note from the Keth Avalon delegate's aide finally surfaced. It surfaced in the wrong place. A routine document audit triggered a cross-reference flag, and the file landed in Valoran's queue because she was the administrative coordinator for human affairs, a role she had quietly accumulated without anyone formally assigning it to her. The note read, Delegate Isenvor, post-session, human compliance vote. Direct quote. They said yes too quickly. Find out what they didn't give up. Valoran read it, set it down, picked it up again. Then she did something she had not done in 11 years of administrative work. She filed an internal request to speak directly with Ambassador Mackin. The request was approved within 2 hours. She should have found that speed reassuring. She did not. The meeting took place in a small conference annex off the main conclave building, a room used primarily for the kind of conversations that neither party wanted documented by environmental recording systems. Valoran arrived first. Mackin arrived exactly on time, alone, without Farrell, which was itself a statement. Undersecretary, Mackin said, settling into the chair across the table with the particular economy of movement that Valoran had noticed in humans who spent time in low-gravity environments. You flagged a request for a private meeting. I imagine this isn't about the Farathy application. It isn't, Valoran said. I've been reviewing the compliance documentation. It's thorough documentation. It is, Valoran agreed. That's what I want to discuss. The pause. Something moved in Mackin's expression, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. The conclave, Valoran said carefully, issued the accord under the assumption that humanity's strategic armaments represented your primary deterrent capacity. The removal of those armaments was intended to reduce your capacity to project asymmetric threat. That's my understanding of the accord's intent, yes. The compliance documentation, Valoran continued, records the precise threshold of every category. The exact yield. The exact range parameters. The exact delivery classifications. She set a physical copy of her summary on the table, a deliberate choice, harder to flag than a digital transfer. Every human facility complied to within 2 to 8% below the stated threshold. Voluntarily. Without being asked. Mackin said nothing. That level of precision, Valoran said, is not the behavior of a species surrendering a deterrent. It is the behavior of a species cataloging what remains permissible. The silence stretched for 4 full seconds. That's a very careful reading, Mackin said finally. Ambassador. Valoran leaned forward slightly. Delegate Isenvor asked his aide to find out what you didn't give up. I am asking you directly. What is Earth's actual deterrent? Mackin looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Valoran would replay in her memory for the rest of her professional life. You're asking the wrong question. Then what is the right question? You should be asking, Mackin said, why no species has ever successfully invaded a human-held planet. Not in the 112 years since we achieved spaceflight. Not once. She paused. We didn't always have nuclear weapons, Undersecretary. We had them for less than a century before we met the Conclave. But we've been defending territory for about 300,000 years. Valoran opened her mouth. Mackin stood. I'll make sure the next compliance report is filed on schedule. Thank you for the meeting. She left. Valoran sat in the empty room for a very long time, and the photograph of the human city with no visible fortifications sat in her memory like a weight she could not put down. No visible fortifications. She had read that as absence. She was beginning to understand it was the opposite. The first Keth Avalon probe arrived in Earth's outer system 4 weeks later. It was not a military probe. The Conclave's charter prohibited unilateral military positioning within another member species' home system without formal authorization. It was a survey vessel, technically, registered as a geological assessment platform. The Conclave's administrative record would later show that Valoran flagged the registration within 6 hours of filing, noted the discrepancy between declared mission parameters and actual sensor loadout, and submitted a formal inquiry to the Keth Avalon delegation. The inquiry was acknowledged and then quietly buried. The probe transmitted for 9 days before it went silent. The final transmission was a standard telemetry burst, unremarkable in every technical sense. What made it remarkable was what the data showed in that last burst. The probe had identified 47 distinct communication nodes across Earth's surface, 17 orbital installations of ambiguous classification, and a pattern of deep subsurface EM signatures that the probe's geological assessment software had logged as anomalous, possible natural tectonic activity, investigation recommended. Valoran obtained a copy of the transmission through a cross-departmental data-sharing protocol that most administrators didn't know existed. She ran the subsurface EM data through a geological modeling database. The signatures were not tectonic. They were regular, rhythmic, distributed across 6 continents in a pattern that no natural geological process would produce, but that an engineer planning redundant network infrastructure absolutely would. She stared at the distribution map for a long time. Then she looked up what humans called the system. She found it in a publicly available Earth infrastructure document from decades before first contact, a technical white paper on something called continuity of operations planning. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but one passage stopped her completely. The primary principle of hardened continuity infrastructure is that no single point of failure should be able to disable the system. Secondary principle: the system's existence should not be apparent from the system's surface presentation. She read that twice. The system's existence should not be apparent from the system's surface presentation. She looked at the photograph of the human city again. The one with no visible fortifications. The thing that had been sitting in the back of her mind for 7 months finally assembled itself into language. The humans had not failed to build defenses. They had built defenses that looked like nothing. And then, when the conclave demanded they disarm, they had surrendered the things that looked like weapons, precisely, carefully, with meticulous documentation, while the thing that actually protected them remained exactly where it had always been. Underground. Distributed. Invisible. Not a deterrent you could see from orbit. A deterrent you would only discover by trying to conquer them. She requested a second meeting with Mackin. This time the response took 18 hours, and when it came, it wasn't an approval. It was a personal message, marked informal, no administrative record. I think you already understand, Valoran. The question isn't what we kept. The question is what the conclave was really afraid of, and whether they were afraid of the right thing. Valoran read the message 3 times. Then she did something she had not done since her first year in administrative service. She went back to the original conclave debate transcripts. Not the official summary. The raw session recordings. She searched for the earliest mention of the human question. She found it in a closed session, 14 months before the Accord vote. A session she had not attended because her clearance level at the time had not covered closed plenary meetings. The transcript had been partially redacted, but administrative archiving systems had a particular failure mode that experienced record searchers knew to exploit. The redaction software removed the text, but the timestamp gaps remained, and if you knew the average speaking pace of each delegate on record, you could estimate the length of the removed passages. 3 of the gaps were long. One of them was very long. She found the unredacted portions that survived around the edges of the longest gap, and she read them in order. The issue is not the weapons themselves, which means that removing the weapons addresses only the visible portion of the concern. The actual question before this body is whether a species that has never, in its recorded history, permanently lost a defensive engagement. And if that pattern holds at galactic scale, then the Accord is not a disarmament. It is a test. The text ended there. The speaker was listed as Delegate Isenvor of the Keth Ava. The test. Vorin sat back in her chair. The room felt very quiet. The conclave had not demanded humanity's weapons because it feared the weapons. It had demanded humanity's weapons to see what humanity would do next. Dominic Farrell found out about the probe 3 days before the official conclave inquiry was scheduled to begin. He found out because he was good at his job in ways that his enthusiasm sometimes obscured, and because he had spent the previous 6 months quietly developing a relationship with a junior analyst in the Murith Observer delegation who passed him information not out of any ideological alignment but simply because she found humans philosophically interesting and Dominic was the only human she'd spoken to at length. He knocked on Mackin's office door at 0630 station time. "There's a second probe," he said before she could speak. "Not Keth Avalon. Murith Registry. Already in the inner system." She looked up from her terminal. "When did it cross the boundary?" 6 days ago." She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "And the Murith haven't mentioned it?" "No. Neither has the conclave." "No." She stood, moved to the window. The station's observation port showed a slice of the conclave facility's central spire, angular, vast, 4,000 years of institutional architecture expressing the same thing it had always expressed. We have decided what order looks like, and you will fit within it. Dominic, she said quietly, what do you think would happen if something tried to land on Earth right now? Militarily. Full-scale ground assault. He considered it carefully, which she appreciated. Badly for them, he said finally. Give me a number. How long do you think a ground campaign would last before an invading force was completely exhausted? He was quiet for a moment. I mean, Earth's geography alone, the supply line problem, the population distribution, he trailed off. Realistically? Years. Maybe decades. Without orbital bombardment, which the Accord technically still permits us in a defensive context. Which is why we signed the Accord, she said. He stared at her. Think about it, she said. What did the Accord actually restrict? Our ability to strike first. Our ability to project force outward. It did not, legally, technically, by the letter of the resolution, restrict anything about what happens when someone comes here. He stopped. Started again. That's not how the conclave framed it. No, she agreed. It isn't. She turned back to her terminal. Get me a direct channel to Undersecretary Valoran. Unsecured line, her personal frequency. Unsecured? She should know we're not hiding this conversation. The pause. She'll find it more credible that way. The call lasted 22 minutes. Valoran recorded none of it, which was itself a form of documentation. The absence of a record in a position that generated records constantly was a record of a kind. What Mackin told her, in the clipped and precise language of someone who had thought carefully about exactly how much to reveal and in what order. Earth had complied with the Accord completely. Every designated weapon system above threshold had been decommissioned with full verification. The documentation was accurate, comprehensive, and deliberately precise, because precision served them better than ambiguity when the documentation would eventually be reviewed, and it would be reviewed. What the Accord had not addressed, because its framers had designed it around the weapons they could see. 300,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to make a piece of land impossible to hold. Terrain modification techniques that predated written language. Communication infrastructure engineered specifically to survive catastrophic surface damage. A population that had been, in various forms, in continuous conflict with something for essentially its entire existence as a species, which produced not soldiers but something harder to quantify, a collective relationship with sustained violence that no species which had achieved peace before achieving spaceflight could fully model. We are not a martial species, Mackin said at one point. That's the misunderstanding. We don't like war. We find it horrific. But we are a species that has survived by being very, very difficult to finish. Valoran was quiet for a moment. There's a difference. Yes, Mackin said. There is. The Conclave's deterrence modeling, Valoran said slowly, working through it as she spoke, assumes that a species with sufficient strike capacity can force surrender by threatening annihilation. That model works if the target species will psychologically capitulate under sufficient threat. It works very well, Mackin agreed. For species that have a threshold, a point where the calculation tips and surrender becomes rational. And humanity's threshold has never been located, Mackin said quietly. Not by the civilizations that tried. Not by the ones that are still trying to find it on paper, in debate chambers, in closed sessions that leave 6-minute redaction gaps in their transcripts. Valoran inhaled slowly. The probe, she said. Both probes, Mackin corrected. And the Drethry survey satellite we detected 8 months ago that nobody has officially acknowledged yet. The pause. We've been counting. You've been counting, Valoran repeated. Since when? Since the first one, Mackin said. Since before the Accord vote. We knew the survey would happen. We knew the probes would follow. We knew the closed sessions were happening, not the content, but the fact of them. The pause. We've had 112 years to watch how this sequence unfolds, Valoran. We've seen what happens when a new species enters a civilization that has never truly been tested. There's always a period of evaluation. And the Accord was part of that evaluation. The Accord was the evaluation. We complied precisely. We documented everything. And we waited to see what would happen next. Mackin's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, exactly. Something older than anger. The question was never whether we'd give up the weapons. The question was whether giving up the weapons would change anything fundamental about what we are. The silence that followed was long enough that Valoran almost spoke into it. It didn't, she said finally. No, Mackin agreed. It didn't. The Conclave's formal inquiry into the Keth Avalon probe was scheduled for 3 weeks hence. In the interim, something happened that nobody had planned for, that no model in any Conclave strategic assessment had predicted, and that Valoran would later identify as the exact moment the institutional understanding of humanity shifted permanently. A Drethari vessel, not military, the designation was technical research, made an unscheduled entry into Earth's lunar orbital zone. It was there for 11 hours before Earth's orbital monitoring stations issued a formal notification to the Conclave Duty Administrator, citing the vessel's presence as noted, non-threatening, consistent with scientific survey parameters, no response required. The Duty Administrator forwarded it to Valoran as a routine flag. She stared at the notification for a long time. The humans had detected the Drethari vessel. They had logged it. They had assessed it as non-threatening. And then they had done nothing except file the paperwork. Not because they couldn't respond. Not because they lacked the capacity. Because they had decided, in whatever quiet process of institutional calculation produced such decisions, that the correct response to being observed was to observe back, document thoroughly, and let the record accumulate. She thought about the photograph again. The city at night. The lights like embers. No visible fortifications. She finally understood what she had been looking at. The city wasn't undefended. The city was bait. Not in a hostile sense. Not a trap in the conventional meaning. Something more patient and more terrible than a trap. An invitation. Come here, the undefended city said to anyone looking down from orbit. Asterisk, come here and find out what 300,000 years of defending territory produces. Come here and discover the threshold. Come and discover there isn't one, asterisk. She typed a message to Mackin. A single sentence. Asterisk, I understand now. What do you need from us, asterisk? The response came 4 minutes later. Asterisk, nothing. We never needed anything. That's what we've been trying to tell you, asterisk. The conclave session convened. The inquiry proceeded. The Keth Avalon delegation accepted formal censure for the unauthorized probe with a dignity that suggested they had expected it. Delegate Isenvor, in his statement to the chamber, said something that the official transcript recorded faithfully and that almost no one in the chamber understood in the moment. We sought to understand the nature of human deterrence. We were operating on incomplete assumptions. We have corrected our model. He sat down. Across the chamber, in the human observation suite, Dominic Farrell turned to Mackin and said quietly, that sounded almost like a warning. To the other delegations. It was, she said, about us. She was quiet for a moment. On the chamber floor, the session continued. Procedural language, recorded votes, the machinery of civilization turning over as it had for 4,000 years. The Drethari lost their political standing in this chamber 700 years ago, she said, because they built weapons that frightened everyone and then gave them up when pressured. After that they were never fully trusted again. She paused. We complied with the accord. We'll comply with every future accord. We'll be cooperative, transparent members of this conclave for as long as the conclave exists. And that's the warning, Dominic said slowly. That compliance doesn't make us less. The Drethari were disarmed, Mackin said quietly. We were not. He looked at her. The weapons were not the deterrent, she said. They never were. The conclave looked at the nuclear warheads and the orbital platforms and saw the danger. They demanded we surrender it. We did. She turned from the glass. They were looking at the electricity in the wires, Dominic. Not at what built the wires. Not at what would build them again from nothing in the dark, in the middle of a war while still fighting. A pause, very quiet. We have done exactly that before. More than once. The Conclave's historians know this. Isenvor knows this. And now they've updated their model. Which means what, exactly? He asked. For us. For how they treat us going forward. She looked back through the diplomatic glass, at the 4,000 years of institutional order arranging itself below, every species in its position, every delegation performing its calculated relationship to power. It means they'll be very polite, she said. And very careful. She watched Isenvor speak to his aide in quiet tones. And they'll never quite be able to decide whether we are the most trustworthy species in this chamber or the most dangerous one. She let that sit. And the honest answer, she said at last, is that there is no difference. Valoran filed her final administrative summary on the human compliance case 14 days later. It was thorough, precise, and recorded everything that was documentable. What it did not record, what she had chosen to leave in the private file on her terminal, labeled with an administrative code nobody would search for, was the final thought she had put in writing only for herself. She had spent her career processing the paperwork of species entering and accommodating themselves to the Conclave's order. She had watched species disarm, reposition, reframe their histories to fit the shape the institution required. She had understood this, on some level, as the price of galactic civilization. The price of not being alone in the dark. What she had not understood, until a photograph of a city with no visible fortifications, until a compliance record of impossible precision, until a probe that went silent and a message that said we have been counting, what she had not understood was that there was a category of species for which the choice between dangerous and safe was not actually a spectrum. Every species the Conclave had ever processed could be made safe. Given the right incentives, the right pressures, the right combination of reward and consequence, every species eventually found the arrangement that let it exist in the Conclave's framework without being a threat. Every species had a threshold, a point where the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of accommodation. She had believed this was universal, a property of intelligence itself, that any mind capable of calculating consequences was also capable of calculating surrender. She wrote the last line of her private file and then sat looking at it for a long time. The question is not whether humanity will be a threat to galactic order. The question is what it means that we have been peaceful neighbors for 112 years, that we have complied fully with every agreement, that we have been cooperative and transparent and present at every table, and that not one species in this chamber, not one analyst in any intelligence service, not one delegate who has studied the historical record, believes for even a moment that any of this makes humanity safe. They comply. They cooperate. They smile across the conference table. And in the back of every calculation, in the margins of every strategic model, in the redacted minutes of every closed session, the same question repeats asterisk. What happens if they stop? She did not write an answer. There was no answer she could write that would not be smaller than the question. She closed the file and went back to work. Somewhere below her office window, 1,000 light-years from a city whose lights looked like embers from orbit, 4,000 years of galactic civilization continued its sessions, recorded its minutes, issued its resolutions. And somewhere in that same galaxy, distributed across 6 continents and threaded through 200,000 years of accumulated memory, something very old and very patient and very difficult to finish went about its business. It was not waiting. It had never needed to wait. It simply persisted, the way fire persists in the roots of a burned forest, invisible and patient and wholly unimpressed by the fact that the forest above it is gone. The galaxy had demanded humanity disarm. And humanity had smiled, and signed the paperwork, and handed over every weapon the galaxy had been frightened enough to ask for. What the galaxy had not yet found the right question to ask. The question that would have changed everything, the question that Valoran had spent 7 months assembling from photographs and compliance records and redacted transcripts and the silence of a Drethri vessel floating unmolested in lunar orbit, was not what weapons do humans have. It was what are humans like when the weapons are gone. The answer was the same as it had always been. Exactly the same.